The letter arrived at Paramount Studios on a Tuesday morning, postmarked from a town in Ohio nobody in the mailroom had ever heard of. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, written by a hand that shook. The words inside were worse. "You get to be the hero in the movies. We were the ones who actually died out there." Wait, because Gary Cooper read that letter 3 times, then folded it into his jacket pocket and never wrote back. What he did instead would take a returning soldier 15 years to understand, and even then, he'd never be completely sure. March 1946. The war had been over for 7 months, but its echoes were still arriving in mailbags across Hollywood. Studios received hundreds of letters every week from soldiers, from families, from widows and orphans, and men who'd left pieces of themselves on beaches and in forests an ocean away. Most of these letters were grateful. Thank you for the entertainment. Thank you for the morale. Thank you for giving us something to think about besides dying. This letter was not grateful. The soldier's name was Robert Callahan, 24 years old, from a town called Miller's Creek in southeastern Ohio. Population 2,400. He'd enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor, shipped out 6 months later, and spent the next 3 years moving through North Africa, Sicily, and finally into France, where a German artillery shell had landed close enough to leave him with a shattered left leg, a partially deaf right ear, and dreams that woke him screaming at 3 a.m. He'd come home in October 1945 to a town that wanted to celebrate him and a body that wouldn't cooperate. The leg had healed wrong despite 2 surgeries. The ear rang constantly, a high whine that made concentration impossible. The VA hospital in Columbus was 3 hours away and always full. The waiting lists measured in months. The doctors overwhelmed and undersupplied. Robert Callahan had a lot of time to think, and somewhere in all that thinking, all that pain, all those nights staring at the ceiling while his wife pretended not to hear him crying, he'd started to get angry. Not at the Germans, not at the Army, at Hollywood. Listen to what he wrote, because the words matter. "Dear Mr. Cooper, I watched you in Sergeant York before we shipped out. The whole company did. We cheered when you won and cried when the men died, and walked out of that theater feeling like heroes before we'd ever fired a shot. Then we went to war, the real one. The one where your friends don't give speeches before they die. They just stop breathing in the mud, and you keep moving because stopping means joining them. I left parts of myself in France, parts that aren't coming back, and I came home to find out that you're still making movies about brave soldiers, while the real ones are rotting in VA hospitals that don't have enough beds or doctors or medicine. You get to be the hero. We were the ones who actually died out there. I don't know why I'm writing this. You'll never read it. Some secretary will throw it away, and you'll go on making your pictures and collecting your money and playing dress-up, while men like me learn how to walk again. But I wanted you to know. I wanted someone in that world to know what it feels like to be used up and thrown away." Robert J. Callahan, Corporal, U.S. Army, Millers Creek, Ohio. The letter reached Cooper's desk because his assistant, a woman named Helen Marsh, had learned over 15 years which correspondence her boss would want to see. The grateful letters she handled herself, sending form responses with printed signatures. The business inquiries went to his manager. The interview requests went to publicity. The angry ones, the ones that carried real weight, real pain, those she put in a separate folder. Cooper had asked her to years ago. "I want to know when someone's hurting," he'd told her, "even if I can't fix it." She put Robert Callahan's letter in the folder. Cooper read it that evening, alone in his office after the day's shooting had wrapped. Remember what he didn't do, because it's the absence that defines the story. He didn't write back, didn't draft an apology or an explanation or a defense, didn't tell Robert Callahan about the USO tours he'd done, the military hospitals he'd visited, the guilt he carried for spending the war making films while other men his age were dying. He just read the letter 3 times, folded it into his jacket pocket, and asked Helen to find out everything she could about Millers Creek, Ohio. What she found wasn't unusual, it was just invisible, the way small towns are invisible to people who live in cities and make movies and read newspapers that only cover places big enough to matter. Millers Creek had sent 83 men to war. 11 hadn't come back. 14 had returned with wounds that would mark them for life. Missing limbs, damaged lungs, burns, and the invisible injuries that didn't show on the outside but turned fathers into strangers and husbands into ghosts. The town had no hospital. The nearest medical facility was in Chillicothe, 40 minutes away. The VA system was supposed to help, but the VA system was drowning in 3 million returning veterans and couldn't help anyone fast enough. The men of Millers Creek who needed rehabilitation, physical therapy, prosthetics, psychiatric care, had to travel to Columbus, a 6-hour round trip, if they could get appointments at all. Most of them couldn't afford the travel. Most of them waited. Most of them got worse instead of better. Robert Callahan was one of them. His leg had healed at a bad angle because he'd missed his follow-up surgery appointment. The VA had rescheduled 3 times, and by the 4th rescheduling, the bones had already fused wrong. He walked with a permanent limp now. He would walk with it forever. Here's what Gary Cooper did with that information, because actions reveal what words conceal. He called his business manager, William Hartley, the same man who'd helped him with the Dawson Farm situation years later, though that's a different story. I need you to set something up, a medical fund for a town in Ohio, anonymous, completely anonymous. What kind of medical fund? Rehabilitation services for veterans, physical therapy, prosthetics, whatever they need. The town is called Millers Creek. They've got men coming home broken and nowhere to fix them. How much are we talking about? Cooper was quiet for a moment. However much it takes, start with 10,000. See how far it goes. If they need more, we give more. And you don't want your name attached. I don't want any name attached. Set up a foundation, a trust, whatever keeps it invisible. The money comes from nowhere. It just appears. Hartley had worked with Cooper long enough to know when questions were unwelcome. I'll make some calls. There's a hospital in Chillicothe that might be willing to set up a satellite clinic if the funding's there. Make the funding be there. Notice what Cooper never said. He never mentioned Robert Callahan by name, never said the letter had prompted this, never created any thread that could be traced from an angry soldier's words to a Hollywood star's money. The letter and the response would exist in separate universes connected only in Cooper's mind. The Millers Creek Veterans Rehabilitation Fund was established in May 1946, administered through a law firm in Columbus that specialized in charitable trusts. The firm's partners knew the benefactor's identity. Attorney-client privilege required it, but no one else did. To the town of Millers Creek, to the VA, to the newspapers that eventually ran small stories about the mysterious donations, the money came from an anonymous philanthropist whose identity was never revealed. The first year, the fund provided $12,000, enough to bring a physical therapist to Millers Creek twice a week, enough to cover travel costs for veterans who needed specialized care in Columbus, enough to purchase wheelchairs, crutches, and prosthetics for men who'd been told they couldn't afford them. Robert Callahan was one of the first beneficiaries, though he didn't know it. Listen to how the news reached him, because the path matters. In June 1946, 3 months after he'd mailed his letter to Hollywood, Robert received a call from the Chillicothe Hospital. A new rehabilitation program had been established for veterans in the Millers Creek area. His name was on the list. Could he come in next Tuesday? He almost didn't believe it. He'd been waiting 11 months for an appointment. Now suddenly there was a program. There was availability. There was a physical therapist who wanted to see him. He went. The therapist, a woman named Clara Bennett, who'd spent the war working with wounded soldiers at Walter Reed, examined his leg and told him the truth. The bones couldn't be rebroken and reset at this point, but with proper therapy, with exercises and strengthening, he could improve his mobility significantly. He'd never run again, but he could walk without pain eventually, if he did the work. "How is this being paid for?" Robert asked. "There's a fund. Some donor set it up. Nobody knows who." "Nobody. Anonymous. Even the hospital doesn't know. The money just shows up every quarter through some law firm in Columbus. We don't ask questions. We just use it." Robert did the work. 6 months of therapy, 3 sessions a week, exercises at home every night. By Christmas 1946, he was walking 2 miles a day. By spring 1947, he'd gone back to work at his father's hardware store, standing on his feet 8 hours a day for the first time since France. He never connected it to the letter. Why would he? A bitter note sent to a movie studio and an anonymous medical fund appearing in Ohio. There was no reason to believe they were related. The letter had disappeared into Hollywood's vast machinery, probably thrown away unread. The fund had materialized from nowhere, a stroke of luck, a random act of generosity. But the fund didn't stop. And that's where the story gets complicated. Here's what happened over the next 15 years, because persistence reveals intent. The Millers Creek Veterans Rehabilitation Fund continued operating long after any reasonable one-time donation would have run dry. Every quarter, money arrived. When costs increased, the donations increased to match. When the Korean War created a new wave of wounded veterans, the fund expanded its services. By 1960, the fund had provided over $180,000 in services to veterans in southeastern Ohio. It had helped establish a permanent rehabilitation clinic in Chillicothe. It had paid for prosthetics, wheelchairs, home modifications, job training, and psychiatric care for hundreds of men who would otherwise have had nowhere to turn. And still, nobody knew where the money came from. Robert Callahan had become, by then, a different man than the one who'd written that furious letter. The therapy had worked. The pain had faded. He'd taken over his father's hardware store, married a woman named Dorothy who'd grown up on the next farm over, raised 3 children who never knew how close their father had come to being swallowed by his own bitterness. But he'd never stopped wondering about the fund. It had become a minor obsession. He served on the town council for 8 years, and every year he asked the same questions at budget meetings. Where does the money come from? Who's behind it? Can we find out so we can thank them? The answers were always the same. Anonymous, untraceable. A law firm in Columbus that wouldn't reveal its clients. A benefactor who preferred to remain unknown. "Someone's watching out for us," his wife Dorothy said once. "Does it matter who?" "It matters to me." Robert was staring at the quarterly statement from the fund, the same document he'd been staring at for 15 years. Someone's been sending money to this town since 1946, since right after the war, since... He stopped. Since what? Nothing. But something had clicked in his mind, a connection he'd never made before. "Do you remember that letter I wrote back in 46? The one I sent to Hollywood? The one to the movie star, Gary Cooper? I never got a response, not a word. Just mailed it off and never heard anything." So the fund started 2 months later, 2 months after I told Gary Cooper that men like me were being forgotten. Dorothy looked at him carefully. "Bobby, that's a pretty big leap. A lot of angry soldiers probably wrote letters to Hollywood after the war. Why would your letter matter?" "I don't know. Maybe it didn't." He set down the statement. But someone's been paying attention to this town for 15 years. Someone with enough money to keep it going. Someone who doesn't want credit for it. You think it's him, Cooper? I think, Robert shook his head slowly, I think I need to know, one way or another. Remember that Robert Callahan was a soldier. When he decided to do something, he did it properly. He started researching, not randomly, but systematically, the way he'd learned to read maps and plan approaches and assess enemy positions. He requested records from the law firm in Columbus. Denied. He tried to trace the fund's banking information. Dead end. He wrote to the VA asking if they knew who'd established rehabilitation programs in southeastern Ohio. No response. Finally, in 1962, he did something that felt slightly desperate. He wrote another letter to Gary Cooper. Dear Mr. Cooper, you probably don't remember me. 16 years ago, I sent you an angry letter about the war. You never wrote back. I understand why. I was bitter and unfair, and you owed me nothing. But something happened after I sent that letter. Something I've never been able to explain. A fund appeared in my town to help veterans like me. Anonymous. Untraceable. It's been operating for 16 years. It's helped hundreds of men, and no one knows who's behind it. I've spent years trying to find out. I've hit dead ends everywhere. But I keep coming back to the timing. The fund started 2 months after I wrote to you. I'm not asking for confirmation. I know you might not even read this. But if there's any connection, if my letter reached you and if you did something about it, I want you to know what it meant. That fund saved my life. Not literally, I wasn't going to die, but I was going to spend the rest of my years angry and broken and convinced that nobody cared about men like me. Instead, I got help. I got better. I got to watch my children grow up while walking beside them instead of sitting in a chair feeling sorry for myself. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about a lot of things. If this letter reaches you, I hope you know that. Robert J. Callahan, Millers Creek, Ohio. The letter was mailed in January 1962. 4 months later, Gary Cooper died. Robert never got a response. The letter was found in Cooper's personal effects, in a box of correspondence that his family preserved but never made public. It sat alongside the original 1946 letter, both of them folded together, kept for 16 years in a drawer in Cooper's study. The fund continued after Cooper's death. His estate, through the same law firm, maintained the donations for another 12 years until 1973, when the account was finally closed and the remaining balance transferred to a permanent endowment at the Chillicothe Hospital. Robert Callahan found out about the estate connection in 1975, when a young lawyer at the Columbus firm made an error and sent a document to the wrong address. The document mentioned the Cooper Family Trust by name. It was a small mistake, quickly corrected, but not before Robert had seen it. He sat with that knowledge for 3 days before telling anyone. It was him, he said to Dorothy, his voice quiet in a way she hadn't heard in years. All along. 16 years of anonymous donations. It was Gary Cooper. Are you sure? I'm sure. He was holding the document, though it had already been demanded back by the law firm. He never said a word, never took credit, never even let us know he'd read my letter. He just helped. Quietly, for 16 years. Dorothy sat beside him on the porch of the house they'd lived in for 30 years, looking out at the town that had nearly lost all its wounded sons, the town that had been saved by money from a man none of them had ever met. What are you going to do? Robert thought about it for a long time. Nothing, he said finally. He wanted it to be anonymous. That was the whole point. If I start telling people now, I'm taking that away from him. I'm making it about gratitude instead of about the help. But don't people deserve to know? Maybe. But he didn't want them to know. And after everything he did, I think that's the one thing I can give him back. His secret, the way he wanted it. Robert Callahan died in 1998 at the age of 76. By then, he'd told 3 people about the Cooper connection: his wife, his oldest son, and his pastor. All 3 kept the secret. His son broke it in 2015 in an interview for a documentary about charitable giving in rural America. By then, Robert had been dead for 17 years, Dorothy for 8, and everyone directly involved was gone. The secret had outlived everyone who'd made it. "My father sent an angry letter to a movie star," the son said, "and that movie star spent 16 years quietly paying for his rehabilitation and the rehabilitation of every other veteran in our town. Never said a word, never asked for thanks, just kept sending money until the day he died, and then made sure his estate kept sending it after." The interviewer asked the obvious question: why? Why would Gary Cooper do that? The son thought about it. "I asked my dad the same thing once. He said he didn't know for sure, but he thought maybe it was guilt. Cooper never served in the war. He was too old, or he had deferments, or whatever it was. And my dad's letter had accused him of playing hero while real soldiers died. Maybe that hit something. Maybe Cooper decided the only answer wasn't words. It was action. 16 years of action." He paused. "Or maybe it wasn't guilt at all. Maybe it was just decency. My dad said something once that stuck with me. He said the letter he wrote was designed to make Cooper feel terrible. It was cruel and unfair, and he was ashamed of it for the rest of his life." But Cooper's response wasn't to defend himself, or to prove my dad wrong, or to rub his nose in all the good things he'd done. The response was just to help, quietly, without asking for anything in return. Not even forgiveness. The son looked at the camera. "That's the part that gets me. My dad spent his whole life trying to thank a man who never wanted to be thanked. And the man just kept helping anyway. I don't know what you call that. But it's something. The fund's impact can still be measured in Millers Creek and the surrounding counties. The Chillicothe Rehabilitation Clinic, established with Cooper's initial donations, still operates today. It's treated thousands of veterans from 3 different wars. A plaque in the lobby thanks the anonymous benefactor whose generosity made this possible. Nobody's ever attached a name to that plaque. The law firm's records are sealed. The Cooper family has never confirmed the connection publicly, but in Millers Creek, in the families of the men who came home broken and were made whole again, there's a story that gets told about an angry letter and an unexpected answer, about 16 years of silence and 16 years of checks, about a movie star who played heroes and a soldier who thought he was a fraud, and about what happened when the soldier was wrong in every way that mattered. Robert Callahan's original letter is preserved in an archive now alongside Cooper's personal correspondence. Scholars can request access. Most of them don't know what they're looking at, just an angry note from a wounded veteran, unremarkable among thousands of similar letters sent to Hollywood in 1946. But if they look carefully, they might notice that the letter is folded differently than the others, creased more deeply, worn at the edges from handling. The letter of a man who was read 3 times on a Tuesday evening in March and then carried in a jacket pocket for weeks while its recipient decided what to do. The answer wasn't words. It never is when words aren't enough. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. This is a dramatized story inspired by real people and events. Specific dialogue, scenes, and side characters are creative reconstruction for storytelling purposes.